I have suspicions that some of the claims I make in Always a Bigger Fish, that conservatism isn't at its core about fiscal responsibility, limited government, or the rights of the individual, but is about maintaining social hierarchies, that it believes people are fundamentally unequal and likes the free market because it sorts people according to their worth, and even softly implies capitalism itself may be innately anti-democratic, might raise some eyebrows. So I'm gonna show my work on this one.
Ich kann mir das vorstellen, dass das in den Staaten total offensive ist für Leute, ne? Aber also für mich war dieser Gedanke, der war sozusagen ein Nebenprodukt, als ich angefangen habe, über Gesellschaft nachzudenken, dass das für mich völlig klar ist, dass Konservative sozusagen, also man muss aus sich heraus irgendwie konservativ sein, um in die rechte Richtung zu gehen. Das geht gar nicht anders. Alle rechten Strömungen vereint dieser Grundgedanke, dass es natürlich ist, Hierarchien zu haben. Also, das ist so intuitiv.
Two of the architects of conservative thought were Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre, who formulated much of their political theory while writing about the French Revolution. They, in turn, were influenced by earlier writings from Thomas Hobbes on the English Civil War. And what all three of these men were doing in writing about these wars was defending the monarchy. The sentiment that the masses should be powerless in the face of nobility was being challenged, and while these men thought the revolutionaries themselves were actually quite compelling, the democracy they were fighting for, Hobbes, Burke, and de Maistre found repulsive. Come the end of the revolution, when it seemed democracy might actually spread across Europe, Burke especially began to hypothesize ways that one's position within the aristocracy might be preserved even should the monarchy fall. He turned his eye to the market. So, okay, around the cusp of the 19th century, the prevailing economic theories were those of Adam Smith, who championed what's called the labor theory of value, which I don't super want to get into because there's like a billion videos about it already, but really briefly, if you take materials out of the ground and turn them into useful goods, it is that labor that makes the good more valuable than the raw material. And when someone buys that good, they cover the cost of the materials plus the value your labor has added to them. In contrast with this, what Burke argued was, well, a lot of nebulous things, but among them that, in fact, when a person of means buys a good, that, rather than the moment the good is produced, is when value is bestowed upon it. Value is not dictated by the producer, but by the consumer. Now there's like 2 centuries of argument about this. We're not going to dig into it all, but obviously this is in some sense true. If the people with money don't want to buy a good at a certain price, eventually the price will come down. So price is not solely dictated by labor. But
also für mich, der ja ein Buch über Emergenz geschrieben hat und jetzt lange über Emergenz nachgedacht hat, war die Sache mit der Preisbildung auch ein Nebenprodukt. Also Preisbildung habe ich in meinem Buch hingeschrieben und das war sozusagen einfach ein ganz natürliches Nebenprodukt aus der Tatsache mit den Machthierarchien. Das ist einfach ganz entspannt entstanden. Da musste ich nicht lange drüber nachdenken. Insbesondere, weil die Neoklassik ja gar keine Antwort auf die Preisbildung hat. Ne? Die Neoklassik kann es ja gar nicht erklären, was mit der Preisbildung ist.
But what Burke does is claim that price and value are the same thing. No one ever gets cheated, no one ever gets a good deal. Whatever the buyer pays for the thing, that's what the thing is worth. Your labor is only as valuable as the degree to which it satisfies the desires of the moneyed classes. This was Burke's nod to the fact that, within capitalism, the wealthy held outsized influence, being that the more money you had, the more value you could dictate. And he argued that this was moral, that the wealthy deserved this influence. Burke was, by the way, wealthy. Sort of. He had a royal pension. What he felt the French Revolution revealed was not that oppressive nobility was bad, but that France must have just had the wrong nobles, because a proper aristocracy wouldn't have been overthrown. The problem was, as we've discussed, not the hierarchy itself, but the wrong people being in power. The revolution had taught him that perhaps power should not come by birthright. Perhaps we needed a system whereby those deserving of power could prove their worth. This should ideally be war, but capitalism would suffice. The structure of royalty would continue to exist, simply derived by different means, because the structure of democracy, where on election day the nobleman has no more power than the commoner, was to an aristocrat.
Ne? Und das, was im Wettbewerb passiert, ist ja sowas wie Krieg. Ne? Es ist ja auch Wettbewerb zum Zwecke, dem anderen seine Wettbewerbsfähigkeit kaputt zu machen.
Profane. What the structure needed was some tinkering to make it democracy-proof. So that's Burke. Over the next century, democracy did, in fact, spread across Europe, and Burke's, and several others, theories of value were picked up and iterated on in what came to be known as the Marginal Revolution, by economists Karl Menger, Stanley Jevons, and this Valjean-looking motherfucker Leon Walras. Marginalism amped up the idea that it is
Ich finde, der sieht tatsächlich aus wie Varg Vikernes.
a good's utility to the consumer and not the worker's labor that gives it value, which confers a unique power upon those with money, and brought this thinking into a post-monarchical world. Their theories became especially popular when people realized they could be used to rebut Marxism. Jevons was taught all over Europe, and Menger became core to the Austrian school. And by the time we get to the Austrians, this massive theories has
Die Austrians. Das heißt, er wird noch das covern in einem Video.
somewhere after Burke and before Hayek, coagulated into what we know of today as conservatism. These are among the most influential thinkers in conservative thought, and they're in a direct lineage with Burke and de Maistre. Now, while Burke is called the father of modern conservatism, these boys are not the alpha and omega of early conservative thought. But their ideas helped form the basis of conservatism and have never gone away. If you can point to some paradigm shift in the history of conservatism where the royalist sentiments of Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre were rooted out, I'd love to hear about it, because I listen to the thinkers championed by conservatives throughout the ages, and I keep hearing the same thing, that humans are innately unequal, and society flourishes when power is doled out to the deserving.
Mhm.
Friedrich Nietzsche was not a conservative, but was deeply influential on the early marginalists, and he claimed the purpose of society was to produce the handful of great men who created everything that made life worth living, believing, quote, "Only the most intellectual of men have any right to beauty, to the beautiful. Only in them can goodness escape being weakness." James Fitzjames Stephen, who wrote a book-length rebuttal against early progressivism, believed, quote, "To obey a real superior, to submit to a real necessity and make the best of it in good part, is one of the most important of all virtues, a virtue absolutely essential to the attainment of anything great and lasting." Hayek and Schumpeter believed, respectively, that, quote, "The freedom that will be used by only one man in a million may be more important to society and more beneficial to the majority than any freedom that we all use," and, quote, "What may be attained by industrial or commercial success is still the nearest approach to medieval lordship possible to modern man." He's saying it's a good thing, by the way. Need I mention Ayn Rand's belief that, quote, "The man at the top of the intellectual pyramid contributes the most to all those below him, but gets nothing except his material payment. The man at the bottom, who left to himself would starve in his hopeless ineptitude, contributes nothing to those above him, but receives the bonus of all their brains." The godfather of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, echoing Burke's yearning for a good war,
Ja,
felt
das ist wirklich, weil die ihre eigenen Schemata nicht zu Ende denken. Ne? Die sehen das so und denken irgendwie, das ist ein guter Gedanke und dann bleiben sie dabei einfach. Weil sie machen keine Dialektik in ihrem Kopf. Ne? Sie überlegen sich nicht, was wäre denn, wenn jetzt jemand kommen würde oder ich würde zu mir selber kommen und sagen, was ist, wenn das Gegenteil wahr ist. Wie würde ich denn darauf reagieren? Diese Frage stellen sie sich gar nicht.
Hierarchy should extend beyond the borders of a single country, believing, quote, "What's the point of being the greatest, most powerful nation in the world and not having an imperial role?" And modern conservatives love the natural hierarchies of Jordan Peterson, who believes, quote, "We keep behaving as though conservatism's disdain for equity isn't there, or if it is, that it's new. But it's been there since the beginning. Conservatism upholds the status quo and defends the powerful, first from democracy, then from communism, now from social justice. Conservatism has rallied every time a movement has tried to share power with the disadvantaged. They were against same-sex marriage, they were against giving women the vote, they were against freeing slaves. Note, I said conservatives, not Republicans. Do your research. Conservatives say we are the party of measured steps, of caution, of evolution over revolution. And that's usually just before they say, but now is the time for swift, decisive action. Most every Republican claims to be a break with tradition. This time, we're gonna flip the script, bend the rules, outspend Democrats, invade your privacy, and start a war with no exit strategy. And that's what they've always said. All that changes is which continent the war is on. I'm not gonna say the slow, stodgy conservative doesn't exist, but it has never typified the party. Rhetorically, it's a character they bring out to contrast themselves with whenever they need to rally their reactionary base. They tell us that's what their party is like, and we just take their word for it. I don't feel the need to pretend that just because most democracies have a left wing and a right wing, that both are equally valid and moral. There is no rule that proves this. There's only the liberal sentiment that saying otherwise is poor sportsmanship, a standard the right does not hold itself to. Conservatism is a reactionary politics that has at best mixed feelings about democracy, where my biggest issue with liberalism is that it's ill-equipped to deal with the problem of conservatism and does not fully commit to its own democratic principles.
Exakt. Und im Prinzip ist das auch Teil meiner Kritik in meinem aktuellen Video, ne? Die Linke bei uns ist ja auch einfach nicht glaubwürdig. Sie hat nicht die Glaubwürdigkeit rumliegen mit der Systemfeindlichkeit. Sie hat keine gesunde Systemfeindlichkeit am Start, sondern nur so eine Pseudo-Systemfeindlichkeit.
I'm going into all of this not because I want to stick it to the people who insist I don't research my videos, although I a little bit do, but because we can't talk about the alt-right if we keep portraying them as a break with the conservative tradition. They are the conservative tradition, only more. There's nothing they believe that conservatives don't have a long history of being sympathetic towards. They're just usually more ambivalent about it. As I've said before, this is ultimately my interpretation of history, and while many experts agree with me, I am not an expert. But I do my homework. So, tell you what, I've made a post on Tumblr listing all the books, essays, and documentaries I'm consuming for this series, the ones I have lined up, the ones I've completed, and some notes on what I've found valuable in them. I'm going to treat this as a living document and add to it as the work continues. Not that the people who say I just make shit up ever read the show notes, but I will keep a link in the show notes of every video, so if you...
Ich habe überlegt übrigens, wo ich das gerade sehe, ob ich vielleicht auf meiner Steady-Page, da kann man ja sozusagen Artikel schreiben und hinter die Paywall packen. Dass ich vielleicht auch für meine eigene Ordnung im Kopf die Bücher, die ich lese, da mir einfach Notizen hinschreibe, was in diesen Büchern drin steht. Mit meinen Worten. Und das dann einfach damit gleich vertreibe sozusagen, damit Leute noch ein anderes haben, irgendwie, keine Ahnung, die 5 Euro im Monat da drauf zu klicken oder so. Einfach so als Gimmick. Wäre das was? Ist das eine Idee? Macht das Sinn? Also ich meine, das zu verschriftlichen so?
You want to check my work or research alongside me, you can do that. I have also live tweeted several books, including the primary source for this and the previous video, The Reactionary Mind by Corey Robin, under the hashtag Ian live tweets his research. So if you want a play-by-play of an entire book...
Ich komme nicht mehr raus. Ich fange jetzt ich lese so viel, also ich bin jetzt sozusagen drin. Ich habe jetzt seit einem Jahr, bin ich am Bücherlesen. Und ich habe halt einen Stack von Büchern und ich habe heute schon wieder eins bestellt. Also es wird nicht weniger, sondern immer nur noch mehr. Das heißt, ich werde einfach immer noch mehr Bücher lesen. Na, das ist jetzt sozusagen eigentlich erstmal für die nächsten Jahre nicht wegzudenken.
Complete with my own observations, that's where you can find it. So far, in addition to Robin, I've done Bob Altemeyer's The Authoritarians, Jason Stanley's How Propaganda Works, and one weird essay on Lara Croft I did for the Fury Road video. If you want to read more about the history of conservative philosophy, in addition to The Reactionary Mind, I recommend No Law for the Lions and...
Was ich gerade zur Zeit lese, ist witzig. Denn ich bin gerade fertig geworden mit 2 Büchern. Ich habe auf meinem Nachttisch gehabt From Democracy to Freedom. Da bin ich jetzt durch. Und ich habe Schocktherapie durchgelesen von Claudia Kempfert. Davor habe ich Sexismus und Feminismus gelesen. Und Claudia von Werlhoff.
Many Laws for the Oxen is Liberty by Elizabeth Sandifer in the essay collection Neo-Reaction of Basilisk. Elle recently got some grief from Nazis, so maybe consider buying her excellent book. Going forward, if anyone comments that I clearly don't know anything about conservatism, I hope you will stand with me in not taking them too seriously, unless they demonstrate having done at least some
Ich bin kein
research.
schneller Leser. Ich muss oft eine Seite komplett nochmal lesen, weil ich wegdrifte. Was mir hilft, ist, nicht an einem PC zu sitzen. Also am besten im Zug. Für mich ist Zugfahren optimal.
Because I do mine.
Also, oh, fuck, ich habe hier drauf geklickt. Ich wollte, also ich schwanke, was ich als nächstes lese. Eigentlich wollte ich irgendwann Erzählende Affen lesen. Aber ich habe ja auch noch genug andere Bücher. Also ich weiß nicht, was ich als nächstes lese. Das muss ich mir jetzt überlegen. Ich bin heute sozusagen mit den beiden Büchern fertig geworden. Das entscheide ich jetzt am Wochenende, wenn ich wieder im Zug sitze, was ich jetzt als nächstes lese. Ich habe jetzt erstmal mein Jacobin-Abo wieder abbestellt, weil ich arm bin und mir das nicht mehr leisten kann. Jacobin habe ich sozusagen immer zum Füllen. Wenn ich gerade nicht wusste, welches Buch ich lese, dann habe ich einfach Jacobin-Magazin gelesen. Aber ja, also hier sind genug Bücher. Hier sind genug Bücher, die ich noch lesen muss.
Say for the sake of argument, your friend Gabe is starting to worry you. Gabe's always been just, a regular guy, not very political. He likes video games, sci-fi, comics, Star Wars, and anime. White guy shit. The only offbeat thing about him is you suspect there's like a 20% chance he's a furry. For all intents and purposes, Gabe is a normie. But recently, Gabe's been spending a lot of time on some radically conservative forums, and listening to radically conservative podcasts, and picking some radically conservative arguments with you and your friends. You never would have expected this, not from Gabe. And given the speed it's happened, it's worrying to think where it might be headed. How have the alt-right gotten their hooks into your friend? If you've ever known a Gabe, this video's for you. Here's how to radicalize a normie. Step 1, identify the audience. What you need to know before we begin is around 2013, the Nazis went online. Hate groups in the US, as tracked by the Southern Poverty Law Center, had been growing in number since the Knots, but between 2012 and 2014, they dropped by almost a quarter. Patriot groups dropped by over a third. However, hate crimes stayed about the same. Radical conservatism was not shrinking, but decentralizing. Still radical and still often violent, but now full of white nationalist nomads unlikely to join a formal organization. This didn't make them harmless. What it did was protect their asses from the typical hate group cycle of getting the public's attention, making allies in conservative media, swelling their numbers, and then eventually disgracing themselves with failures in fighting and, often enough, members committing horrific acts of violence, which come with social and sometimes legal
Das stimmt
consequences.
natürlich, ne? Dadurch, dass es so viele dezentralisierte Gruppen sind, bilden sie keine große Hierarchie, in der sie sich dann zerfleischen können. Das ist das, was man bei der NPD beobachten konnte und was man garantiert bei der AfD jetzt auch sieht, sobald sie gewählt werden. Dann werden die sich zerfleischen wegen den ganzen, alle wollen irgendwie was abhaben von dem Korruptionskuchen und so.
Consequences for all the other members. So the alt-right and their fellow travelers these days don't so much have members. They have hashtags, followers, viewers, and subscribers. This insulates them from their own audience. If Gabe, as a member of that audience, were to go out and commit a crime on their behalf, there'd be little doubt they had a hand in radicalizing him, but it'd be very hard to claim they told him to do it. On some of these sites where Gabe spends hours and hours of his day, he's never created an account or left a comment. The people radicalizing him don't even know he's there. This distributed nature is what makes the alt-right and the movements connected to it unique. You may remember a notable proof of concept for this strategy. Doing almost everything online has, as compared with traditional hate movements, dramatically increased their reach and inoculated them from consequence. The trade-off is a lack of control. And so we come to Gabe. Gabe exists at the intersection of the kinds of people the alt-right is looking for, straight white cis men who feel emasculated by modern society, primarily, though they do make exceptions, and the kinds of people who are vulnerable to recruitment. Gabe fits the first profile in that he got bullied in high school and often feels he has to hide his nerdy side for fear of getting ridiculed. The alt-right also has success with men who can't get laid, or recently got divorced, or feel anxious about an influx of non-white people in their community. These things can make one feel like less than the confident white man they are supposed to be. And it's the closest they will ever come to being minoritized. Regarding the second profile, it's important to know that Gabe is not categorically different from you or me. He's a cishet white dude. His problems are not unique. There's not a ton of research into the demography of the alt-right, but there may be a higher than average chance Gabe has a history of being abused or comes from a broken home. You don't know if that's true of Gabe, he's never said. But most abuse survivors don't become Nazis. The things that make people like Gabe recruitable tend to be situational. It happens often during periods of transition, as dramatic as the death of a loved one, or as benign as moving to a new city. Things that make people ask big life questions. Gabe has concerns like economic precarity, not knowing his place in a changing world, stressful working conditions. In other words, Gabe is suffering under late capitalism, same as everyone, and it's entirely plausible he could have gone down the path to becoming a leftist. Now, this is not to make an economic anxiety argument. The animating force of the far right is and always has been bigotry. But the alt-right targets Gabe by treating his economic anxiety as one of many things bigotry can be sold as a solution to. It is their aim that when dissatisfied white men go looking for answers, they find the alt-right before they find us. Step 2. Establish a community. Were Gabe pledging an old-school hate movement, there would probably be a recruiter to usher him into an existing community. But that's the kind of formalized interaction modern extremists tend to avoid. Online extremism has many points of entry and everybody's journey is unique, so rather than be comprehensive, we will focus on what are, in my estimation, the two most common pathways. The far right creates a community Gabe is likely to stumble into, or infiltrates a community Gabe is already in. The stumble upon method has two main branches, one of which is just Gabe ends up on a Chan board, which we've already done a video about. The other is kind of the polar opposite of 4chan's cult of anonymity. Gabe ends up in the fandom of a far-right thought leader. These folks are charismatic media personalities. That's charismatic according to Gabe's tastes, not ours. I don't understand it either. And these personalities may gain traction on any number of platforms, from podcasts to reportage to blogging, though the most effective platform for red pilling is, and yes, I am biting the hand that feeds me, YouTube. They may get Gabe's attention through fairly conventional means, like talking about or even generating controversy to get themselves trending, while some of the more committed will employ dubious SEO tactics like clickbait, Google bombing, and data voids. But what they tend to have in common, especially the most accessible ones, is that they don't present themselves as entry points to the radical right. In fact, many did not set out to be far-right thought leaders, and may not think of themselves as such. Though they are often selling products of which the alt-right are among their biggest purchasers, and it's not like they're turning the money away, so there's that. How they present is the same way anyone presents who wants to be successful on social media. Accessible, approachable, authentic. The face-to-face relationship a budding extremist forms with their recruiter or the leader of their hate group's local chapter are here folded into one parasocial relationship with a complete stranger. Why this person appeals to Gabe is they're not selling politics as politics, but conservatism as a kind of lifestyle brand. They rely heavily on critiquing or
und auch als so als irgendetwas, was einfach so völlig natürlich und logisch daherkommt. Ne? Die Schlussfolgerungen basieren ja alle auf dem naturalistischen Fehlschluss. Das heißt, die kommen alle immer mit dieser Essenz von, das ist eigentlich vernünftig, eigentlich wissen wir es doch, dass es so ist. Lass dir bloß nichts einreden von irgendwelchen komischen Hipstern.
or ridiculing the left. Feminists are
Opa ist
oversensitive,
eigentlich ein geiler
black
Boy.
people unintelligent, queer folks doomed to loneliness, and trans people insane. Now, I don't know if it's a coincidence that these are all things Gabe thinks about himself in his low moments. By contrast, they don't sell conservatism as having sounder policies or a more coherent moral framework, but that abandoning progressive principles and embracing conservative ones will make Gabe happier. Remember, Gabe isn't looking for white nationalism or misogyny. What he wants is the cure to his soul sickness. And these friendly micro-celebs are here to offer a shot of life advice with politics as the chaser. It is extremely important that politics be presented as a set of affects, not a set of beliefs. The second pathway is infiltration, which is its own beast. Media personalities sometimes become gateways to the right almost by accident. They do something edgy, a part of their audience reacts positively, and facing no real consequence, they do it more. This leads to further positive reinforcement from conservative fans, the rest of the audience acclimates, and the cycle repeats, the personality pushing the envelope further and further based on what flies with their increasingly conservative audience. In this way, they become a right-wing figure by both radicalizing and being radicalized by their audience. Infiltration is deliberate. The far right will reliably target any community that has 1. A large white male population, 2. Whose niche interests allow them to feel vaguely marginalized, and 3. Who are not used to progressive critique of said interest. This isn't to say progressive critique doesn't exist or hasn't been baked into the property from the beginning, but that it has been so far easy for white guys to ignore. As such, progressives within that community probably don't talk politics much, and women and minorities are perfectly welcome to post, same as anyone, but just, don't make identity politics, like a thing. Given Gabe's proclivities, he's probably already in a number of fan communities where he can geek out and not get teased. And this is where the far right will go looking for him. Communities are at their most vulnerable to infiltration at times of political discord. This can happen naturally, say a new property in the fandom has a black protagonist, or it can be provoked, say a bunch of channers join the forum and say provocative things about race to get people arguing, or both. Left to its own devices, the community might sort out its differences and maybe even come out more progressive than they started. But with the right pressure applied in the right moment, these communities can devolve into arguments.
Ja, ich denke auch, dass die Leute viel zu sehr unterschätzen, dass man einfach Multiaccounts machen kann. Ne? Wie ich schon gesagt habe, als wir so 2000 im Internet unterwegs waren, haben wir das gemacht. Multi-Accounts und dann Rollenspiele gespielt und Leute in eine Debatte, die gefaked war, reingeholt. Und die dachten, die sind Teil davon. Dabei waren sie der einzige Protagonist in diesem Spiel. Und also, das ist im Prinzip die einfache Version davon, wie die Verschwörungstheorie, die ich jetzt habe, dass man zum Beispiel sagt, okay, Right-Wingers und Geheimdienste haben ein Interesse daran, dass Leute in Solingen ausrasten und Leute umbringen. Ja, weil, das ist ja klar. Davon haben die was. So wie Benjamin Netanyahu die Hamas finanziert. Das ist keine Verschwörungstheorie, sondern das ist gemessener Fakt. Ne? Und so könnte es ja mit Geheimdiensten in Deutschland auch sein. Wenn man sich überlegt, dass so Leute wie Maaßen mal Chef vom Verfassungsschutz waren und so. Und wir wissen ja, dass Geheimdienste und Polizeistruktur inhärent hierarchisch ist und deswegen einen Appeal für Leute hat, die sowieso schon konservativ und rechts sind. Ja, also die Tendenz ist definitiv da. Ne? Warum sollte das nicht auch so sein? Ändert zwar nichts, ne? Ist aber sozusagen ein Standardgedanke. Und so ein bisschen kommt mir das hier auch vor.
About the need to remove a nebulously defined politics from the conversation. The adage about bros on the internet is political means anything I disagree with. But it would be more accurate to say here, political means anything on which the community disagrees. For instance, Nazis are bad is an apolitical statement because everyone in the community agrees. It's common sense and therefore neutral. But paradoxically, Nazis are good is also apolitical. Because Nazis are bad is the consensus, Nazis are good must just be an edgy joke. And even if not, the community already believes the opposite, so the statement is harmless, tolerable. However, feminism is good is a political statement because the community hasn't reached a consensus. It is debatable and therefore political, and you should stop talking about it. And making political arguments, no matter how rational, is having an agenda, and having an agenda is ruining the community. Now, it is curious how the things that provoke the most disagreement tend to be whichever ones make white dudes uncomfortable. One of life's great unanswerable mysteries. You can gather where this is going. A community that doesn't tolerate progressivism, but does tolerate Nazism, is going to start collecting Nazis. Nazis whose goal is to drive a wedge between the community and the left. Once the left acknowledges, hey, your community's developing a Nazi problem, the Nazis, who are, remember, trusted apolitical members of the community who might just be kidding about all the Nazi shit, say, did you hear that, guys? Those cultural Marxists just called all of us Nazis. Wedge. Similarly, any community members who say, but Nazis, though, are framed as infiltrators pushing an agenda, even if they've been there longer than the Nazis have. They get the wedge, too. This is how fandoms radicalize. They are built as, yeah, I'll say it, safe spaces for nerds, weebs, and furries, and are told that the left is a threat to their safety. And given a choice between leaving a community that has mattered to him for years and simply adjusting to the community's shifting politics, the assumption is that Gabe will stay. This assumption is right often enough that a lot of fandoms have been colonized. What is true of both these methods, Gabe finding the right or the right finding him, is that Gabe does not come nor stay for the ideology. He's here for the community, the sense of being with his people, of having his fear.
Und dann hat man diese In-Group-Vibes, ne? Und mit der In-Group kann man das alles machen.
Validated and his enjoyment shared. The ideology is simply the price of admission. Step 3.
Loyalität zur In-Group.
Isolate.
Klärt das.
There is a vast, interconnected network of far-right communities out there, and Gabe is, at this point, only on the periphery. In order to keep him in, they need to disrupt his relationships to other communities and become more and more his primary online social space. Having made this space hostile to the left, they now seek to break his connections to progressives elsewhere in his life. This is hard to do online. The whole appeal of moving radicalism to the internet is that your away from keyboard life doesn't have to change. You are crypto the moment you log off. Some thought leaders will encourage their audience to cut ties with family of origin, or DFU, but even then, they can't monitor whether the audience has actually done it in the way an in-person movement could. And so alienating Gabe from the left is less controlled, and consequently, maybe less total. How much Gabe isolates is up to him. But the vast majority of far-right media presumes an alienation from the left. Part of conservative bloggers and YouTubers making the left look pathetic is doing a lot of takedowns and responses. This is a constant repetition of the left's arguments for the purpose of mockery. And for Gabe, it starts to replace any engagement with progressive media directly. He soon knows the left only through caricature. It also trains him, if he does directly engage, to approach the left with the same combative stance as his role models. For reference, see my comment section. And this is only if he doesn't partake in one of the many active boycotts of SJW media. In addition to mocking the left's arguments, they also, curiously, appropriate them. This is one part sanitization because liberal centrism is more socially acceptable. Indeed, many figures on the outer layers think of themselves as moderates even as they serve as gateways to radicalism. But also, many of Gabe's problems could be addressed by progressive leftism, so they sell him racist and sexist versions of it. Yes, there is a problem with workers being underpaid and overextended, but the solution isn't unions, it's deporting immigrants. Yes, there is a chronic loneliness and anger to being a man in the modern age, but it's not because of the toxic masculine expectations placed on you by the patriarchy, it's women being slutty. Yes, wealth disparity does mean a tiny percentage of elites have more influence over culture and politics than the rest of us combined, but the problem isn't capitalism, it's the Jews. And it's hard for Gabe to reject any of these ideas without, in the process, rejecting the progressive ideas they're copied from. The right's take the red pill is, to the untrained eye, similar to the left's get woke, or at least the Bowdlerized version of Get Woke that is no longer specifically about race, which came to fashion once white people started saying it. Grumble, grumble, grumble. Take the red pill or reject them both. Either is a step to the right. As this rhetoric slips into his day-to-day conversation, even as seemingly harmless irreverence, it may strain relationships with people who are not entertained by this shit. Off-color comments about race and gender can certainly be wearying for female and non-white friends, which can lead to a passive distance or an eventual confrontation, which only seems to confirm what his reactionary community says about liberal snowflakes. If he says these things on social media, he may get his account suspended. And if he comes back under an alt, you can bet his new reactionary friends will be the first to reconnect, applaud the behavior that got him banned, and repeat should he get banned again. A few cycles of this, and he's lost.
Aldi Boy, das ist schwierig. Ich denke, echte Rassisten in dem Sinne gibt's nicht. Ich glaube tatsächlich, das ist Schwachsinn. Das sind immer Leute, die vermuten, dass irgendwas so ist und haben bloß die Erfahrung noch nicht gemacht. Also, das wird zum Beispiel richtig gut dargestellt in dem Clint Eastwood-Film, wo er so ein alter Knacker ist. Gran Torino. Der hat mir gut gefallen.
Lost touch with everyone else. Also, his adoption of the insular, meme-laden terminology of his community makes him less and less comprehensible to outsiders. Over time, sources of information get replaced with community-approved ones. Conservative news, conservative YouTube, conservative Wikipedia if he's really committed. The algorithm soon takes note and stops recommending.
Wow. Dass ich sowas noch sehe. Im YouTube drin. Ich meine, hier wird natürlich nicht hingeschrieben, wie Vieh definiert ist und über welchem Raum X und Z und so existieren, aber nicht schlecht.
Media from the left. He stops watching shows with a liberal agenda, which usually means shows starring women and people of color. Now, there is evidence that the human mind responds to fictional characters similarly to real people, and that consuming diverse media can decrease bigotry in ways roughly analogous to having a diverse group of friends, which is one of many reasons we say representation matters. By consuming a homogeneous media diet, Gabe stymies his ability to have even parasocial relationships with anyone who isn't a cishet conservative white dude or one of their approved exceptions. To the extent that any of this happens, it happens at Gabe's discretion.
Also, echte Rassisten müssten ja welche sein, die zu allen Menschen, die sie hassen, weil sie, was weiß ich, Schlitzaugen haben, schon mal ausreichend Erfahrung mit diesen Menschen gemacht haben und nach 10 Jahren immer noch sagen, ich hasse alle Schlitzaugen, weil sie Schlitzaugen haben, weil das einfach schlechte Menschen sind oder was auch immer. Also Rassisten erfinden ja eine Geschichte, die gar nicht da ist, die nicht durch die Realität gedeckt wird und so. Wenn, dann meinen sie sowas wie kulturelle Unterschiede oder also sie meinen irgendwas, was damit korreliert, dass man da was an der Äußerlichkeit festmachen kann. Aber es hat grundsätzlich nichts mit der Idee von Menschenrasse zu tun. Also, die vermischen da einfach statistische Größen und machen sich da sozusagen einen Shortcut, eine oberflächliche Heuristik draus. Und sagen dann, okay, ich bin offensichtlich Rassist, aber das ist nicht.
And at his own chosen pace. It has not been forced on him, only encouraged and rewarded. But the fact that it hasn't been forced can make him all the more willing to accept it, because it seems safe to consider. Even though his life and social circle are changing to accommodate, he does not feel committed. But many Gabes have walked these halls, and if they close the door behind them, there is nowhere left to go but down.
No.
Step 4, raise their power level. And they say we ruined anime. Consider the ecosystem of the alt-right as layers of an onion, with Gabe sitting at the edge and ready to traverse towards the center. No, I'm not just going to reiterate the PewDie pipeline, though if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you do. The outer layer of the onion is extremism at its most plausibly deniable. Without careful scrutiny, the public-facing figureheads could pass as dispassionate, and the websites as merely problematic rather than softly fascist. It is valuable if Gabe believes this as well, that at this stage, he believed the bigotry is simply trolling, the extremists an insignificant minority, and any report of harassment faked. That he believed where he is as deep as the rabbit hole goes, and that he continued to believe this at each successive layer. People in the deepest crevices of the alt-right self-report getting red-pilled on multiple issues at different times in their journey to the center of the onion. If Gabe's first red pill is about the SJWs coming for his free speech, he'll think that's all anyone in his community believes. There's no real racism here, people are just making a point about their right to offend people. Then, when he gets red-pilled on the white genocide, he'll laugh at those alt-light cucks who tried to sweep the...
Ihr Räder. Wir schauen, was eventuell ein paar Edgelords in eurer Community offenden könnte. Also beruhigt euch.
race realists under the rug, and at himself for having once been one, but acknowledge that those channels and websites are still useful for onboarding people, so he won't denounce them. At the same time, nobody takes those manosphere betas seriously, and this process is reiterated with every pill swallowed. Gender essentialism, autogynephilia, birtherism, Sandy Hook truth, Pizzagate, QAnon if he's really out there. The heart of the onion is typically the Jewish question, but these can happen in any order and in any number. But each layer sells itself as being finally the ultimate truth.
Ja, natürlich.
Each denies the validity of the others. The layers ahead, they don't exist, and you are certainly not being directed towards them. They're just the fevered imaginations of...
Naja, kommt auf das Wort Legalisierung an. Das haben wir ja schon festgestellt, dass das, denke ich, das Hauptproblem war. Imp, hast du es dir reingezogen, den Cringe, den ich da in Berlin abgezogen habe?
Overreacting liberals, while the people behind are asleep where you are now awake. That's why they chose the red pill as their metaphor. Take it, and everything will be revealed. That's why it cozies up with conspiracism. But what's supposed to follow is that this knowledge help Gabe in some way, and it doesn't. Blaming immigrants
Und viel wichtiger,
fix the
die
economy,
Frage ist,
and hating women.
Ob du mein Buch jetzt schon mal gelesen hast. Du fandst die Ethikfrau based. Ja, das denke ich mir, dass du das jetzt schreibst. Bist halt doch einfach nur ein alter Edgelord.
Doesn't make men less lonely. But having been alienated from everything outside the onion, once that sinks in, the only recourse on offer is to seek out the next pill. And pills are easy to find. Those within the network have laissez-faire relationships, even if they on paper disavow one another. When they need a source or a guest host, they aren't going to go to the left. They're going to feature each other. The left is the enemy. Their ideas are beneath consideration, and the only reason to engage them is for public humiliation. But you can interview a Western chauvinist, and that doesn't mean you're endorsing him. Just, it's fine to hear him out. Nothing should be off limits in the marketplace of ideas. Besides, Nazis are apolitical. And because these folks keep showing up in each other's metadata, regardless of what they say, Google thinks there is definitely a relationship between the guy just asking questions and the guy denying the Holocaust. Gabe is softly exposed to many flavors of conservatism, just slightly more radical than he is now, and is expected, at the very least, to not question their presence. This is an environment where de-radicalizing, listening to the left, would be sleeping with the enemy. But radicalizing further, you do you, buddy. Gabe's emotional journey, however, is somewhat more complex. If you spend any time reading or watching reactionary media, you've probably noticed it's really fucking repetitive. It's a few thousand phrasings of the same handful of arguments, like there's only so many jokes about attack helicopters. But these people just crank out content, and most of it's derivative. The reason to pick one personality over another isn't because they say something different, but because they say it differently. Gabe just picks the affect it's delivered in.
Genau.
Repetition dulls the shock of the most egregious statements, making them appear normal and prepping him for more extreme ideas. Meanwhile, the arguments themselves, they're not good. Like, BreadTube will never run out of shit to debunk. They are repetitive because they're not good. They're mantric. A good argument you only need to hear one time. If you can follow it, internalize it, and explain it to someone else, you know you've understood it. But a bad argument can't convince you on its own merits, so it will often rely on affect. This can be the snappy, thought-terminating cliche, or the long, winding diatribe that sounds really sensible while you're hearing it, but when someone asks you for the gist, you can only say, go watch these 17 videos and it'll all make sense. Both these approaches are largely devoid of content, but gosh, if they don't sound sure of themselves. And that mode can be very persuasive, but it doesn't stick the way a coherent argument does.
Ja, Thunderfoot macht nur noch richtig geilen Elon Musk-Content. Also, wenn ich mal Zeit habe und ein bisschen genießen will, dann ziehe ich mir ein Thunderfoot-Video rein.
It needs to be repeated, the affect replenished, because the words matter less than the delivery. There needs to be a steady stream of confident voices saying, we've got this shit figured out and everyone else is stupid, or
Yes.
Gabe's gonna notice the flaws. They are not well hidden. And the catch-22 of returning to that stream over and over is that these communities are stressful even as they are calming. People afraid they will die virgins go to forums with people who share and validate that fear, and also say, yes, you will die a virgin. People afraid Syrians are coming to kill us all watch videos by people who share and validate that fear, and also say, yes, Syrians are coming to kill us all. Others have already pointed out that rubbing your face in your worst anxieties is a form of digital self-harm, but I need you to understand the toxic recursion of it. Gabe is going to these communities to get upset. Every emotion is converted into anger because sadness, fear, and despair are paralyzing, but anger is motivating. Whatever his problems, there's always someone he can scapegoat for them, and Gabe feels less helpless when he's
das habe ich auch,
pissed off.
dieses Gefühl, ne? Also es ist wirklich so, es ist einfach toxisch so, diese Bubbles sind toxisch. Ich hänge ja, wie gesagt, in diesen Boomer-Facebook-Gruppen drin rum und so, immer am Lesen, was da gerade trendet und so. Und das ist einfach eine einzige Lethargie, eigentlich ein einziges Trauerspiel so. Und die Spaß-Smileys, die sie machen, wenn sie sich über irgendwelche Grünen lustig machen und so, das ist auch eigentlich alles nur so Schmerz, den die empfinden. Ich glaube, dass gute Gefühle harvesten sie nur, wenn sie Leute zusammen irgendwie überfallen online, ne? Also wenn sie die irgendwie im Twitter reden oder so. Das ist so ihr Ding. So wie damals so ein Clan war oder so, wenn man sich im IRC getroffen hat.
Off. And so while he's topping up on reassuring nonsense, he's also topping up on stress. And being cut off from everyone outside the network, the only place he knows to go to release that stress is back to the place that gives it to him. It's a feedback loop, pulling him deeper and deeper on the promise that, at some point, relief will come. It is a similar dynamic that keeps people in abusive relationships. Yep. When someone in Gabe's community makes a racist joke, they are presenting Gabe with a choice between the human interaction of laughing with his friends and his societal...
Ganz genau, das nervt. Man muss jetzt immer sich rechtfertigen, wenn man die Grünen scheiße findet. Die Rechten haben uns grüne Scheiße finden scheiße gemacht. Sie haben uns das versaut. Das geht mir auch richtig auf den Sack. Vor 3 Jahren war das gar kein Problem.
Responsibility not to be a fucking racist. And not laughing seems ridiculous. Everybody's friends here, no one's getting hurt. This is harmless. And so the irreverent race joke draws a line between the personal and the political and suggests that one can be safely prioritized over the other. One way to look at radicalization is being asked to stick with that seemingly innocuous decision as the stakes are raised incrementally. First with edgier humor, and then comments that are funny because they're shocking, but you couldn't really call them jokes, and then funny comments that are also sincerely angry. But in each instance, since he laughed with his bros the last time, it stands to reason he should keep favoring the personal over some abstracted notion of politics. This is why the progressive adage, the personal is political, is among the most threatening things you can say in these spaces. I'm not trying to make a slippery slope argument. Most of us who laughed at edgy jokes when we were teenagers didn't grow up to be Nazis. It is a slippery slope in the specific context of being in community with people trying to radicalize you. Gabe is a lonely white boy in need of friends, and laughing at a racist joke is personal, and not laughing is political. Staying in a community that has Nazis in it is personal, and leaving is political. The personal is what brings people together, and the political drives them apart.
Richtig.
The only if some of them are bigots part of that.
Ne, ich habe das ja auch letztens, ich glaube sogar im aktuellen Video gesagt, ne? Politisch bedeutet vor allem sich abzugrenzen. Das ist was da irgendwie immer mit dabei ist, ne?
Sentence is usually lopped off. There's this joke on the internet that nerds perceive only two races, white and political. Following that logic, what could be more apolitical than an ethno-state? They are banking on his willingness to adapt his beliefs to suit an environment that meets a need. That same need can be satisfied by white nationalism. There are few things more seductive to people who doubt their own worth than being told, you are valuable simply for being white. And you can sub in male, cis, straight, allosexual, or able-bodied. It just takes priming. By the time Gabe officially embraces bigotry, he's already been acting like a bigot for months. The red pill is just the moment he says it out loud. Change Gabe's surroundings, and you change Gabe. Step 5. The final step in a traditional extremist group would be getting a mission. But that is one thing the alt-right can't do. Once you start giving clear directives, you can't play yourselves off as a bunch of unaffiliated hashtags and think tanks. You are now a formalized movement accountable to its followers, and can be judged and policed as such. To my mind, Charlottesville was an attempt to become such a movement, taking things offline and getting all the different groups working collectively. And as so often happens when these people get in the same space, especially with no official leaders and no means of control over their members, it backfired. Their true colors came out before they were ready, and a counter-protester lost her life. This would be the point where historically an extremist group starts to disintegrate. Their veneer of respectability gone, they are now hated by the public, the media wants nothing more to do with them, and everyone not in jail turns on each other or goes underground. This is also the point where the liberal establishment says, my job here is done, and utterly fails to retake control of the narrative, allowing the next batch of radicals to pick up more or less where the last one left off. But to an already decentralized group like the alt-right, Charlottesville was bad, but eminently survivable. People retreated back to the internet with its code words and anonymous forums, but that's where much of the work was already done anyway. The platforms where they organized kept tolerating them, the authorities didn't classify them as terrorists, and any disgraced figureheads were replaced with up-and-comers. The major change in strategy is that it doesn't seem anyone has tried to formalize the alt-right since. So where does that leave Gabe? He's gone through this whole process of largely hands-off indoctrination, and I should stress, his journey may look like what we've outlined here, or it may look different in places. This video is not comprehensive. But now he's swallowed every pill he cares to, he blames half a dozen minorities for everything he sees as wrong with the world, and no one will give him anything to do. You've got this ad hoc movement frothing young men into a militant fervor, and then just leaving them to stew in their own hate.
Ja.
Should we really be surprised at how many commit mass shootings? This is a machine for producing lone wolves. Leaving men to take up arms of their own volition is a way of enacting terror while being just outside the popular conception of a terror cell. There are also, of course, more classic militias that will offer Gabe clear directives. They are recruiting from the same pool. And Gabe may stop short of this, settling in a middle layer that suits him or finding the inner layers too extreme. But violence is the logical conclusion of an ideology of hate. And should Gabe take this step, he can approach violence in the same incremental fashion he approached conservatism. He can start with yelling at people on Twitter, and then maybe collective brigading, DDoS attacks, sharing docs, leaking nudes, calling their phone numbers, texting them pictures of their houses from the sidewalk. These acts of cruelty become games of one-upmanship within his community. All this can start as far back as step 2 and get more intense the deeper he goes. And some people join explicitly to partake in harassment and violence the way Gabe joined to talk about anime. But this behavior can serve as a kind of buy-in. The left and the feminists and the LGBTQs and the Muslims and the immigrants are all within his community subhuman. You've maybe heard the conservative catchphrase, feminism is cancer. Well, you don't treat cancer by having a respectful exchange of ideas with it, but by eradicating it down to the last cell. Cruelty against the left is framed as necessary and righteous. From any other perspective, posting someone's bank information is something you might feel ashamed of, which creates a psychological imperative not to consider other perspectives. A thing that keeps people in is staving off the guilt they will reckon with the moment they step out. Gabe is also aware that anything he's done to the left could be done to him if he leaves. Some communities even keep docs on their members as insurance. And the things he's encouraged to do to the left will likely make him feel that the left would never take him now. The radical right is the only home he's got. Harassment becomes another tool of isolation. Steadily, options for Gabe are whittled down to being a vigilante or a nihilist. There are periods of elation, moments the alt-right feels it's winning, or more accurately, the people they hate are losing, are like cocaine. They are authoritarians after all. But the times in between are mean and angry. They are antisocial, starved of emotional connection, consuming incompatible conspiracies that may at any point run them afoul of one another, devoted to figureheads who cater to but cannot risk leading them, and living under constant threat of being outed to the left or turned on by the right for stepping out of line. Gabe took this journey for the sense of community and purpose, and but for the rare moments everything goes their way, the alt-right can't maintain either. They can only keep promising his day will come, a story he could get from a $5 palm reading. The feeling there's nothing left but to kill yourself or someone else is so common, it's a meme. But there is a third option. Gabe can leave.
Ja, also das Problem ist, du hast halt beim Leaving von solchen Gruppen, also ich meine, es gibt ja nicht umsonst extra Exit-Hilfe. Ne? Also das ist ja wirklich ein Ding. Also es gibt Leute, die unterstützen andere dabei, rauszugehen aus der Gruppe.
Conclusion, for fuck's sake, do not make Gabe your whole ass praxis. Before we continue, I want to state plainly that Gabe went off the deep end because he found a community willing to tell him that because he is a cishet white man, the world revolves around him. Do not treat him like this is true. If a fraction of the energy spent having debates with America's Gabes were spent instead on voter reenfranchisement, prisoners' rights, protections for immigrants, statehood for DC, and redistricting, Gabe's opinions, in the societal sense, wouldn't matter. Reactionary conservatism is a small and largely unpopular ideology that is only so represented in our culture and politics because they've learned how to game the system. And I get it. Those are huge problems that are going to take years to address, where if you know a Gabe, that's a conversation you could have today. And if you think you can get through to him, it's worthwhile to try. This is a fight on many fronts, and de-radicalization is one of them. But it is only one. So please keep it in perspective. It sends an awful message when we spend more time trying to get bigots back on our side than we do the people they are bigoted against. Your value as a lefty does not hinge on whether you can change Gabe's mind. Conclusion. How Gabe gets out. He may just grow out of it. These communities skew young, and some folks hit a point where hanging out with edgy teens doesn't feel cool anymore. He may become disillusioned after the movement fails to deliver on its many promises. He may become disillusioned if something goes wrong in his life and his community isn't there for him. If he feels they like his race and his gender, but don't actually care about him. He may be shocked if he sees the alt-right at its worst before being appropriately conditioned. Charlottesville was a step too far for a lot of people. His community may turn on him for any perceived unorthodoxy, and he may leave out of necessity. He may be separated by circumstance from the community, a trip with no internet, hospitalization, arrest, and not be able to top up on the rhetoric. This may lead him to question his beliefs. his community may disappear, either tearing itself apart or getting shut down by authorities. He may have incidental contact with populations he is supposed to hate, and have trouble reconciling who they are in person with what he's been told about them. In his community, people bond over shared intolerance, but suddenly being tolerant helps him make friends. This is one reason the alt-right has made a battleground of the liberal arts college campus. He may form or revisit relationships outside the network, people who can offer him the connection he's been looking for. This may reintroduce outside perspectives, but more importantly, it rekindles his ability to have healthy relationships at all, something the alt-right has estranged him from. As with recruiters, it seems these escape hatch relationships can sometimes be parasocial, coming to respect a public figure who is on the left or is critical of the alt-right. Someone he is close to may compel him to choose me or the movement. A lot of young men leave to save a romantic relationship. Hearing stories from people who've already jumped may help. There aren't a lot of public formers, and some raise questions as to their sincerity, but it is getting more common and may be the closest we get to exit counseling for the alt-right. He may become aware of the ways he's being manipulated, or have them revealed to him, maybe because he stumbled into BreadTube, I don't know. Knowledge that you are being indoctrinated is no guarantee it won't work. You are not immune to propaganda, but it can help one resist. And he may revisit a core belief system that used to guide him, be it religion or social justice, or a really wholesome fandom, and be reminded of the identity he used to have. Moments like these, in isolation or in aggregate, can inspire Gabe to jump. They are also good times for friends to intervene. The reach and the impunity that comes with the internet means it has never been easier to fall into reactionary conservatism. It has also never been easier to get out. People who exit skinhead gangs often fear for their lives. For Gabe, there's a chance getting out is as simple as going to a different website. Much of his community does not know his name or his face, and he may not be important enough to dox. What doesn't get Gabe out, not reliably, not that I have seen, is an argument with a stranger who proves all his...
Na, also sagen wir mal, also das ist ja jetzt schon, das ist 4 Jahre alt, ne? Okay, auch vor 4 Jahren hatten wir schon sozusagen auch diese normale, gewöhnliche, dass irgendwelche gewöhnlichen Boomer-Onkel auf einmal die komplett das Rabbit Hole runtergehen. Das konnten wir auch damals schon beobachten, ne? Aber diese Radicalization hatte man natürlich in den Staaten viel früher als bei uns.
Facts wrong and his ideology bunk. Facts don't always work because facts don't care about his feelings. This was about staying in a community and holding on to an identity that mattered to him. It was about belonging. And that is something a rando from the other side of the culture...
Das ist das, was ich auch immer sage, ne? Also die Attraktivität kommt immer von der In-Group-Dynamik. Die Leute möchten gerne starke In-Group-Vibes.
War can't give him and probably shouldn't be responsible for. The theme here is human connection. Before he can do the work of disentangling himself and facing the guilt of what he's believed and maybe done,
bei ihm waren die letzten 20 Minuten 30 Sekunden Video, ja. Also bei mir ist es ja so, ich mache den Twitch-Kram ja eigentlich nicht, um euch mit meinen Gedanken zu berieseln. Dafür habe ich ja YouTube. Ich mache das, weil ich sowieso YouTube gucke und mir dachte, ich kann es auch mit der Community zusammentun. Deswegen wird hier tatsächlich viel gegrindet. Also ich schaffe relativ viel Videomaterial, obwohl ich eigentlich im Schnitt nur einmal pro Woche streame.
Has to know there's something for him on the other end of it. That the right hasn't ruined him. They've told him all of history is groups fighting each other over status and that without his clan he'll be in exile. He needs a better story. I don't know that lefty spaces are ideal for this, in no small part because bringing someone who's a bit of a Nazi but working on it into diverse communities is questionable. And it probably wouldn't be good for him either. Having just gotten out of a toxic belief system, he's going to be deeply skeptical of all ideologies. In a perfect world, people who care about Gabe could build for him, to use a therapy term, a holding space. Someplace private, physical or digital, where Gabe can work out his feelings, where he is both encouraged and expected to be better, but is not in the moment judged. That comes later. It is delicate and time-consuming work that should not be done in public. But we find these beliefs, built up over the course of months or years, tend to fall away very quickly with a shift of environment.
Peter Decker, den Namen habe ich schon mal gelesen bei den 99:1 Boys. Aber ich habe mir noch nie was von ihm reingezogen. Ist das nicht so ungewöhnlich? Also ich nehme mal an, dass er einer von den ganz normalen ML-Boys ist. Die Texte schreiben schon seit 50 Jahren.
Change Gabe's surroundings and you change Gabe. But instead, a lot of people who jump are functionally deprogramming themselves, which is working for a lot of them, but it's haphazard, and there are recidivists. If you don't personally know a Gabe or have training as a counselor, you...
Nehmt mir das nicht übel, ich habe keine Ahnung von dieser ganzen Terminologie bei diesen akademischen Linken, möchte ich es mal sagen. Na, also ich habe Kontakt zu den Boys von 99:1, aber das war's auch.
You may not be in a position to help him. Possibly there are things you can do to disrupt the recruitment process or prevent infiltration of spaces you're in. I'm looking into it, but talk to your mods. But elephant in the room, meaningful change will require reform on the part of platform holders. Tools to disrupt this process already exist and are being used on groups like ISIS, but they're not being used on the alt-right because they try oh so hard not to get classified as terrorists. And also any functioning anti-radicalization policy would require banning a lot of conservative politicians. So there's that. But what makes our story better than theirs is that the fight for social and economic justice, though it is long and difficult and frustrating, when it works, it fulfills the promise the right can't keep. It materially makes people's lives better. I am not prone to sentimentality or to giving these videos happy endings. But one thing we have that the alt-right doesn't is hope.
Schade. Die nächste Endnote ist 36 Minuten. Ich denke,